Okay, so welcome to those listening to the Method cast. Today's guest is Dr. Anna Khaylis, and generally when I bring people on, so Anna, the focus, my underlying focus of the podcast is bringing people on specialists that have dealt with trauma, although there's other things as well. So welcome,
Thank
and
you.
we were talking before we started about your story. So can we just go back in and get your story again? Because
Yeah.
remember, I was doing so before you came in, I was doing some research and I just saw British Columbia and it said 1986. I was just like, there's no way you graduated in
No.
1986. So what's the backstory again, if you don't mind repeating it?
Yeah, no worries. Where do you want me to start from?
Um,
College?
well,
Graduate school?
you're from
I'm from California.
yeah,
Yeah, I was born and raised in San Francisco,
nice.
California. Yeah. I got my bachelor's from a college in Southern California.
Wait, can we go
Yeah.
back to actually why you got into what you said earlier about
Oh,
Moldova and
sure.
stuff? Yeah,
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I was born and raised in California. My family immigrated in the 70s as refugees from the Soviet Union, from the country of Moldova. So when I was 19 or 20, this is like the early 2000s, I did my study abroad in Stockholm, Sweden. And this was a time in the country where the Russian, right, there was a lot of kind of challenges dealing with mafia. And one of the things that was happening was human trafficking was increasing in Sweden. And I realized that a lot of the victims, a lot of the survivors were coming from the former Soviet Union. And a lot actually happened to be from the country where my family was from Moldova. And I think this really impacted me, right? Because it was like realizing just from sheer luck of where I was born, lives were going so differently. So I got involved at that point, but it was, I was 19, I was 20. I didn't have any degrees or anything like that. There wasn't much that I could do as a college kid. But I did some translation, I did some volunteering, that kind of thing. But that really kind of set me on a path to wanting to work with trauma and wanting to be a psychologist.
and so you end up in San Francisco.
Yeah, so after I graduated from college, I started graduate school in Palo Alto. I went to Palo Alto University and got my PhD from there. So while I was getting my PhD, I was involved in research at Stanford, focusing on trauma. And I also did my practice, like my practicum, my supervised kind of clinical practice in the Palo Alto VA, which is the hospital for veterans, for U.S. veterans. So I was there for a few years, and then I did my residency at the Minneapolis VA. So the VA system in the United States is a bit different than in Canada, right? The VA system is set up all through the country.
VA.
Veterans Administration.
Okay.
Yeah, to help veterans and soldiers. So, yeah.
And so now you're here in BC.
And now I'm here in BC.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, most of the guests, when I bring them on, I start through trauma, but we go in many ways, and I always ask them, what's your definition? What
Yeah.
is trauma?
Yeah, well, as it's defined in the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, right, the DSM, our kind of Bible of
I've heard of it, yes.
diagnoses, yes. As it's defined there, it's exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. So either by experiencing it directly, by witnessing it, or by learning that it's occurred to somebody close to you.
And is that closely related to PTSD? I was asking someone before.
Yeah.
So the trauma is the event, and the PTSD
Yes.
is what you suffer from after it.
Yes. Yes. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is a diagnostic label that was entered in the DSM in 1980. So PTSD as a diagnosis, it was really meant to capture it's like a constellation of symptoms, right? That's meant to capture like things are going okay. Then something really bad happens. All of a sudden, I'm not so okay anymore, right? I'm having memories coming out of nowhere, intrusive thoughts. I can't stop thinking about the event. I'm having trouble sleeping. My mood's all kind of out of whack, right? So this kind of constellation of symptoms is PTSD. But the first criteria, actually, it's pretty interesting because for the DSM, most disorders don't have like an external criteria, right? It's all about what's going on internally inside. But for PTSD, the first criteria is having experienced a trauma, which is defined by, as I said, right, actual exposure to actual or threatened death or serious injury or sexual violence.
Okay, so I watched another interview of yours. I was just speaking earlier about it, and it kind of hit me what you said. And so this is where the question came from. So actually, I was watching that when I came up with this question to send it to you, and that was most of the people that are kind of coming on, and I'm talking to them. We are behaving from our PTSD later on in life. We've had a traumatic childhood, and
Yeah.
24, 20, we don't even know we have it. Like I didn't even
Yeah.
know I had it until many, many years later.
Yes.
And so then when we are adults, we will talk to friends and I'll say, hey, I saw a therapist and we don't want to deal with it. We don't want to go back to it. We don't want to open that box or talk
Absolutely.
about it. And now we're adults, so we can kind of somewhat deal with our emotions. However, when that event happens, when they're
Yeah.
preteens and stuff like that, can
Yeah.
you talk to them then?
Yeah.
I've never actually even thought of this, but can you talk to them at that point?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. We can talk. We can talk to children about it if children go through a difficult event. It's just with younger children, it's a bit different because younger children don't quite have the language or the brain development to cognitively talk about things, right? So with younger children, it comes out through play, through drawing, that kind of thing. So they'll communicate through playing. But certainly with older adolescents, preteens, I think we must talk about it. We have to talk about it. And if it's, I guess it's a bit different, right? Because if a teen or a preteen goes through a trauma, the quality of social support, right, that they receive once they tell someone about it, typically a caregiver, right? Unless it's, okay, I'm getting kind of all over the place. So
Keep
maybe
going.
we need
No,
to
no, no, that's
narrow
fine.
it down a
No,
bit.
that's fine. That's fine.
But with teens and preteens, right? Like the reality is that like lots of tragedy happens in the world, right? Lots of grief happens in the world, and at some point or another, they may be confronted by it. They may experience it. They may witness it. They may see it on the news. They're going to have lots of questions about it, right?
Yeah.
So I think as parents, and I'm really talking about like from the position of parents, right? From the parental standpoint. We don't, we want to be the primary source of information for our children. Otherwise, if they don't have all the information, they're going to turn to their friend group, or they're going to turn to social media, or they're going to speculate and fill in those blanks, right, with stuff, with fantasies or whatever it is. So I think in terms of like generally talking to preteens or teens about trauma, yes, absolutely. As parents, we want to be ahead of that. And definitely there's certain ways to go about it if you want me to kind of go into a few of those ways, right? So I think firstly, don't be afraid to initiate the conversation. If you have concern about something that your child may have witnessed or seen on the news or, whatever it is, absolutely don't be afraid to initiate the conversation. And sometimes this is actually a good tip for having any kinds of difficult conversations is to do something while you're having the conversation. Go for a walk together, kick a soccer ball around, play a board game, play some chess.
Is this why people are gonna laugh at me? Is this why sometimes when I watch movies, the child has gone through something traumatic, they're letting them play at the same time they're asking them questions?
Yes, absolutely. And it's also because it's through the play that the child is communicating.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, so continue there. Yeah, continue there.
Yeah. But I think, above and beyond kind of anything that you say or any kind of strategy, right? I think the stance, the emotional stance has to be one of calm and reassurance and like, I've got this. Right? Like, so the child feels confident that they're not going to overwhelm you with their feelings or emotions. or questions. So above and beyond anything else, right? But definitely we want to be offering lots of reassurance, lots of normalization, lots of support.
Are we talking about it enough? Are there systems
Yeah.
in place? Because I know there's a lot for adults.
Yeah.
We have our self-help books and everything else type of thing.
Yes.
Is that one? Is that too long of a time to not address the trauma that it gets deeply ingrained in us, or should we address it earlier? How do we even know we're supposed to address it earlier?
Yeah. So I think we need to back up a little bit, right? Because I think we're kind of talking about maybe two different things.
Okay.
So when we're talking about childhood trauma, if we can go back, it's almost like going back to that first question about what is PTSD. And maybe I want to say a few words about this because I think it's pretty important that the diagnosis itself of PTSD was largely established to capture or to address grassroots advocacy efforts by Vietnam veterans. So soldiers who had come back home from the war, from the Vietnam War, this would have been in the 70s or so, right? Began to notice, we're struggling. A lot of us are struggling, and a lot of us are struggling in similar ways. So based on their advocacy efforts, this is how we developed the diagnosis of PTSD. So initial research on PTSD and then subsequently gold standard treatments for PTSD were largely based on the veteran population, initially on the Vietnam veterans, and then expanded to other kind of veteran populations around the world.
Wow.
Yeah. And it wasn't really until the 70s, even 80s, that our study of trauma and PTSD started to include sexual assault and violence, which coincided with the women's rights movement in the 70s and 80s, right? And I think as late as the 70s, medical textbooks still said that incest was very rare and actually not a significant source of psychiatric challenges.
Does Sigmund Freud come in on any of this?
Oh my gosh, yes, absolutely.
Was he paralleling this? Because he said it before the 80s, no? Or is it during the 80s?
He started his work in the late 1800s, right? And he was, there's so much history to this. And a great resource for this is Judith Herman's book. And her work. And so Sigmund Freud started his work in the late 1800s based on a few of the psychiatrists that have come before him when they identified this term hysteria. I don't know if you've heard this before. Hysteria.
Well, I've heard this song by Def Leppard.
Yeah. As they talked about it, right? They noticed this phenomenon of young women dubbed hysterical, who were showing all kinds of, right? They were fainting, they were having physical challenges, they were physical pain, and they called it hysteria. And Sigmund Freud was one of the first to actually start talking to these women. This is how we called it the talking cure, right? That he was the first one who started talking to these women and really started hearing their stories, getting a sense of their stories, and noticed that what most of them had in common, can you guess? A history of sexual abuse or violence. And identified that this must be, the psychological trauma must be the root of all of these problems that these women were having.
Okay, I just want to touch on that. I just want to touch on that. Okay, so, and I brought this up before too. Is part of it, not to minimize what may have happened, can some of it come from not a placebo effect, but if we create an environment where we're giving people excuses, not excuses, but you kind of get what I'm trying to say, is like, so... Is there a danger of sometimes we can kind of put something in someone's head? Like we have to be very careful?
Yes, we do have to be very careful. Yeah. But at the same time also understand that this kind of trauma that he was identifying, right? And I can get into that a little bit later when I talk about PTSD versus what was going on with Sigmund Freud, right? Is that this kind of developmental trauma, right? So repeated chronic trauma that happens in childhood has a devastating effect on brain development, right? It affects literally every single part of our brain and has very pervasive and long-lasting effects throughout our life, which is not quite captured by the PTSD diagnosis, right? Because the PTSD diagnosis wasn't built on this population. But let's put a bookmark in that, okay? Let's go back to Sigmund Freud, because this part's actually really fascinating.
Yes.
Is that once he published his work, right, identifying that most of these women with hysteria had experienced some sort of sexual abuse or sexual violence. Now remember, this is in the late 1800s in the Austrian, like European bourgeois, right, society. Well, what do you think happened? Like, he thought he hit the nail on the head, right? He thought, like, this is it. This is my career. Like, I'm going to be, right? Well, what do you think happened? The society would have had to admit, right? Like, who was perpetuating all of this abuse? They couldn't admit that, right? This was a highly religious Christian bourgeois.
We still have that today.
Exactly. They couldn't admit that there were all of this, right? All of this trauma, all of this sexual violence going on behind closed doors to their young daughters. And the backlash was so severe against him. The backlash was so significant that he backtracked. And he said, you know what? These women must be fabricating this. And hence was born the Freudian theory of, right, what we know now of Freud's theory, right? The ego, the id, like all of that kind of stuff, right? The fantasies, the Oedipal complex. It was all born out of this idea is that of like these women must have been making all of this up. And why would they have made it up? Well, right, this is why. And so the study of trauma around kind of women and sexual abuse and sexual violence was stagnant until the 70s or 80s.
Well, the behavior of people not listening to women is still common.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so it wasn't until the 70s or 80s that we started really understanding, like, wait a minute, right? All of these people who have been assaulted or abused in childhood, they're displaying very similar symptoms to what we see in veterans who have gone through war. But not quite the same, right? Not quite the same. So it hasn't been until pretty recently, I would say, that we have this term called complex trauma. I don't know if you've heard of this. Mm-mm. So complex trauma is repeated, prolonged, chronic traumatic events, usually of interpersonal nature, and usually that occur in childhood. And this has really pervasive kind of widespread effect on brain development and then consequently, right, in terms of relationships and identity and functioning. And it's not well captured by the PTSD diagnosis or by gold standard PTSD treatments. And so we're still really in our infancy of research and understanding of complex trauma. Right? So often people with complex trauma will come in and they'll have like a number of different diagnoses, right? They'll have major depression, they'll have an anxiety disorder, they'll have a whole list of these different diagnoses. They might have the PTSD diagnoses as well, right? And what's really missed is this root of it, which is that as children, they have gone through kind of repeated, chronic, difficult events.
Are you cold? Because I have a heater here.
I'm okay. I'm all right.
Letting all the guests know that come on, I take care of you, and I actually use a heater for you guys as well. So just make sure this is on. There you go.
Yeah.
Okay, so with that said,
Yeah.
Self-talk, self-therapy, positive
Yes.
self-talk. Now I touch on this because is a woman I kind of came into my life many years ago. She was in the same line of work that you were.
Yeah.
And my background was I was doing lots of motivational speaking. And I'd come from a world where I thought that we could talk our way out of things, not knowing at that time.
Yeah.
Not knowing at that time, I have trauma, not even knowing that. I'm
Yeah.
just thinking, self-talk, self-therapy, motivational books, incense, Buddha.
Yeah.
That's enough. But you actually have to talk things out.
Yeah.
So I always think, okay, the whole reason for starting this is my therapist is very open about it. I went and saw him 5 years ago. It changed my life, and it was Dr. Paul James. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. I want everyone to do this. And I would meet people, they'd say, yeah, I've gone once. I'm like, oh, it's not like about going once.
Yeah.
You have to go, a few times. It's just like going to work out at the gym. It takes time to kind of go through to get to that conversation. And, so that's a professional. So, okay. So then someone says, okay, well, so there's 1,000 people. You want them all to go through therapy. Yeah. So we say, okay, we don't want to go. We can't afford it. So what can we do? We'll do affirmations. We'll do self-therapy. And my thinking at one point was because I was going through life in a situation where I had to fend for myself so much, I got used to being independent and I can take care of it myself. I don't need anybody.
Yeah. Which is a really common response, by the way.
Yeah, like I can do it myself. I can do it
myself.
But the same devices that got me to here, I'm going to use those same devices to get me out of it, which isn't going to work. So can you talk on that? Because again, we don't want to deal with it as it is. If we're going to deal with it, before I deal with it, I'm going to go get the book, or I'm going to go buy this.
Yeah.
But there's something to do with talk therapy. Yeah. There's something there. And I'll do the second question afterwards. Can you talk on that? Because the question, I guess, is can we just talk our way out of it? Can we self-diagnose ourselves and do talk therapy for ourselves? My favorite part, which my favorite therapy is the narrative therapy.
Yeah.
Can we just use that on ourselves?
Yeah. Can't comment too much actually on narrative therapy. That's not one that I'm trained in. But this idea of like, can we talk ourselves out of this? It reminds me of a meme I just saw on Facebook, I think, where it's, my therapist tells me I should be nicer to myself. So my brain goes, why are you so mean, you, right? You POS. And that's kind of the trap that
doesn't mean point of sale system either.
I don't know. Am I allowed to swear? I'm assuming no, probably not.
No, you go right ahead. I'm trying to get this heater started. Keep going.
So I think you hit the nail on the head. I think culturally, we are, as a people, as a culture, we are like constantly searching, like, give me the easiest, fastest answer.
As quick as possible.
As quick as possible. You mentioned weight loss. This is the perfect example. What's the latest fad diet that's going to get me to lose 15 pounds in 2 weeks, right? What's the fastest? What's the easiest? That's what we want to do. But in reality, it doesn't work that way. In reality, if we want to get in shape and lose weight, it's long. We have to work hard. It's consistent, right? Eating in a calorie deficit and working out and all this stuff, right? Like, it takes a long time and it takes a lot of effort. And it's something similar, right? Unfortunately, there's just no kind of quick fix. There's no quick, easy fix to this. At the same time, I think in terms of kind of the self-help stuff, I think people, right? I think people legitimately find a lot of benefit in it. I think there's a sense of maybe agency, a sense of control.
Can you tell me what that is? I've only heard that word about 5 years ago.
Agency?
I'm still trying to understand that.
Yeah. It's like a sense of like personal responsibility, right? Like, or personal action. Because I think so much of trauma, and sometimes I think that this is like the key of trauma, or the nature of it, is that control is taken away from you. It's loss of control. You're not in control in that moment of what's happening to you, what's happening to your body. That must be terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. And I think by kind of taking control of one's life, right? Getting that self-help book, doing the affirmations, I think part of it is feeling like I'm starting to get some control over my choices. I'm starting to get some control over what I'm doing. I think there's a sense of connection that people experience with this, right? When they read a book and they realize, wow, it's not just me, right? I think, the nature of trauma is so important because something like a natural disaster, right? Like what has the longest, most long-lasting, most significant effects? It's interpersonal trauma, repeated chronic interpersonal trauma that comes from the caregivers. This has the most devastating effects. Something like a natural disaster, right? That can be interpreted as it's happened to a lot of people. It happened to a lot of people, so it wasn't just me. And this is kind of much more random, right? This is like, it's more random. It wasn't something about me. But interpersonal trauma can feel so much more individual, right? It's just happened to me. And there's so much shame around it, so we don't talk about it. And we think it's just happened to us. And then we think, well, there must have been something wrong that it happened with me, right?
Yeah.
And so by reading these types of books, I think by going to these groups, I think there really is like a sense of connection that happens, like a sense of normalization, right? It wasn't just me. And maybe some of the stuff that I'm experiencing is normal, right? I think of it as a normal reaction to an abnormal situation.
Why do we blame ourselves?
That's a great question. Yeah.
The reason I say that is, and I had the answer. I figured it out a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
My behavior after coming out of a home with so much trauma is, when I got out of that home, I wanted to be. I'm not gonna. I hope I want to say this right.
Yeah.
I wanted to be the person that was in people's lives that didn't cause them too much stress, because I wanted to be okay, because in my head I thought, if I'm not, then I will also be pushed away. I did not know that back then. I figured that out now.
Absolutely. I think there's almost a sense of safety in self-blame. As counterintuitive as that seems, I think, if I blame myself, then there's a reason that this happened. And then maybe if I can figure out the reason that this happened, I can also figure out how not to do it so it doesn't happen. Right? Control was taken away from me so fully. I feel like by self-blame, it's almost like there's a little bit of control that you can take back, right? Because this is the reason. I figured out the reason. But of course, what self-blame does, right? That feeling of shame, that feeling of like there's something wrong with me that this happened is so devastating and so distressing, right? I think the other part of it too is if the trauma comes from the caregiver, right? If the trauma comes from like your source of survival, right? A caregiver is a source of survival, a source of love, the source of food, right? If that's the same source as my terror,
Wow.
Yeah.
Never thought of it that way.
Yeah. My source of survival and my source of terror is coming from the same person. Right? That just disrupts every part of the brain. Our attachment system in the brain, right? Our sense of safety, our sense of security, our sense of self, which is, I think, maybe another reason why the idea of like self-blame and shame, right? It disrupts, we develop our sense of self and our sense of the world and our sense of relationships. We develop that through our relationship with our caregivers, right? That template sets the stage for how we think of ourselves. And if my caregiver is constantly beating me up or abusing me, name calling me, whatever, my caregiver thinks I'm bad, like what choice do I have but to also then think I'm bad? There's something wrong with me. it would be really difficult otherwise, right? Because of how that interactional nature works between a child and a caregiver. Like that sets the stage, that sets the template.
Wow.
Yeah.
The images in my head, I'm just
Yeah.
going back, and as they're gonna going through.
Yeah.
So we talked about the trauma, which
Yeah.
can lead to the PTSD, but what about stress?
Stress is actually adaptive. Stress happens, right? Like when there's some kind of new situation or some kind of difficult situation, our body kind of mobilizes to resolve the situation. I mean, that's what stress is, right? That's it's adaptive. It's like an adaptive way to problem solve. And just referring to my notes, and kind of mobilizes the energy and the resources in our body and our brain to be able to deal with this problem. So if you think of like an upside down U, like a graph, right? A y-axis, an x-axis, and an upside down U. And if you think of stress on the x-axis and kind of functioning or productivity on the y-axis, right? And what that shows you is we actually need an optimal amount of stress to function at our optimal level. If we have too little stress in our life, we're not really motivated, right? Like what motivation would I have had to prepare for this talk if I wasn't stressed about it, right?
Okay, so it's a good thing.
Yeah. So, right. What, like, without stress, how would we meet deadlines? How would we study for exams, right? If we have too little stress.
I can't wait to tell someone this. Oh no, this is good for you.
If we have, though, right, the upside down U, if we have too much stress, that overwhelms the system.
Gotcha.
And then our functioning also goes down, right? So the body responds to psychological and physical stressors similarly. It doesn't differentiate between the two. But it's the too much chronic stress that is going to impact the system, right? And that is going to have negative outcomes, physical problems, mental, right, emotional kind of problems, that kind of thing. So in terms of stress management, right, a lot of people, I think, have the myth maybe or the idea that stress management means eliminating stress, not feeling any stress.
Yeah, we talk about eliminating it all the time. Yeah.
Yes. But that's not realistic, nor is it helpful. Right? With stress, we want to find ways to keep it kind of under that, top part of the U where it's helping us, where it's adaptive. So we want to be realistic about it, right? That there's no way to eliminate stress, and actually some stress is adaptive and helpful.
I skipped over.
Yeah.
We were talking about the self-help and touching on the self-help groups.
Yeah.
Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think with self-help groups, again, I think the benefit is, agency, a sense of control. I think it's connection, right? You realize that you're part of something that's bigger than you, and that it's not just you. That there's other people out there who share your experiences and who share your who understand you, right? And of course the placebo effect, right? If we believe it to be helpful, then there will probably be some benefit from it.
The placebo effect.
Yeah, the placebo effect. I think, of course, the downside of it is that it can become a form of avoidance too, right? Like, I'm doing all of these things, I'm constantly talking about my trauma, but then it's almost like the downside, right? That it could become like a script, or you've come up with a story about it in your head, like a script, and you go through the script, but without actually processing it, without actually working through it.
And that's why one of the notes you sent me, the idea was that that's how we're not designed to do it ourselves.
That's right. And so that goes back to that question of, can we talk ourselves out of it? Right?
Wow.
Can we positive self-talk our way out of this? And that's exactly right. Human beings are not, we're not built to go through this hard stuff alone. We're not designed this way. We're social creatures. We have our hardwired need for connection, our social, like our stress response system is built to be regulated in our connection with others, right? And this starts in infancy when our caregivers soothe us and feed us and comfort us, right? It's in that relationship that we learn to then regulate our stress response system ourselves. And so that's why it's so powerful, right? When we can share our distress with a supportive, validating other who really hears us and really understands us. It's that kind of co-regulation, almost soothes that part of our brain, right? That then helps with the higher level processing.
I'm just laughing.
Yeah.
You're talking about like the self-help groups. I'm just thinking about sitting around with your friends and say, you know what, you're fine. You're good. I'm getting self-help advice or advice from a friend who's also in the same situation as I am, or they're telling me you're fine.
Yeah. So, in terms of the positive self-talk, maybe I'll just take a minute and go through a little bit of how the brain works.
Yes,
is that
please
okay?
do that.
Because it's fascinating. Okay. Because that's I think that'll help kind of make sense of some of this. So. I have a little toy brain at home. I should have brought it, but I'll use my hand instead. Good enough. So if you imagine your brain as my hand, right? So this is kind of the brain stem, the back of the brain, right? This is the most primitive part of the brain. It develops in utero.
Yes. Do you want to do that on there and I can actually film it?
No, that's okay. I can do it. Yeah, I can do it here.
We have a whiteboard in the room here. Yeah. Blah blah blah. Anyways,
I can't draw worth anything, okay. So it's easier to use my hand. But so this is the brainstem.
Actually,
right?
no, wait.
Okay.
I want to. We're gonna wait. No, you're not gonna do it there. I have a better idea.
Okay.
I have a better idea. All right, now that we're back, if you guys watch us on YouTube, you're going to want to watch it on there. But I've given the doctor a whiteboard and a felt pen. Okay, so continue with the brain. You can just wave it, turn it to me, and I'll put it on here. Yeah.
Okay, you want me to draw it on here?
Please do. Yeah, you can do whatever you like there now.
Okay, I'm just gonna stick with this metaphor.
Okay.
But I'll use the whiteboard if I think it might be more helpful. But so this part of the brain, right? That brain stem that's kind of in the back of the brain. We share it in common with reptiles. So it's often referred to as the lizard brain or the reptilian brain. Yeah. And so what that part of the brain is responsible for is automatic functions that keep us alive.
Fight or flight?
No.
Oh, no.
No. Heart rate, breathing, digestion, sleep, kind of alertness, sleepiness, hunger, touch, and that soothing, right, from the touch, temperature, so that kind of thing, and kind of keeps homeostasis in our body. As we move up, so if we kind of cut the brain like this and look right in the middle, kind of over this brain, surrounding this brain stem, is the limbic system. So the limbic system we have in common with mammals. So it's called the mammalian brain, also called the mammalian brain. And this starts kind of developing after birth is when really kind of starts really solidifying. So the limbic system is responsible for sensing changes in the environment, either internal environment or external environment, and alerting us if something needs attention. And if something needs attention, our body produces a host of physiological changes that will allow us to deal with this sudden something that needs our attention. So those are feelings. That's all a feeling is. Feelings get bad rap, don't they? Touchy feeling. We don't want to talk about our feelings. But what feelings are, it's a wave of physiological changes that the brain kind of puts the body in, right, to address any kind of sudden change. And so this is where fight or flight originates, is in the limbic system. There's a little structure called the amygdala, which is like a smoke detector. And so its job, it's constantly scanning the environment. And if it detects a threat, it what's the word I'm looking for? It kind of sends our body into fight or flight. And I want to say this, right? All parts of the brain work together. It's like a symphony. So the limbic system will communicate to the reptilian brain, to the frontal lobes, right? And it'll produce this cascade of events that we experience as fight or flight. So as we go higher into kind of this part of the brain, right? That's called the frontal lobes, the cortex. That's the part of the brain that kind of makes us uniquely human, right? That's the part of the brain that's responsible for kind of abstract thinking, consequences, planning, impulse control, that lives in the frontal lobes. And so those aren't really fully developed until almost the 20s, kind of early mid-20s. So that's why teenagers aren't particularly known for their great impulse control or like consequences, right? Like they don't see like consequences because that part of the brain isn't quite fully developed. It's just starting to develop. So all those parts of the brain work together as a symphony that comes from, I don't know if you've heard of a Dr. Bruce Perry. He's a child psychiatrist, kind of seminal work in the idea of trauma and brain development. And a lot of what we know about the effects of trauma and brain development are based on his work. But the brain kind of all works together in a symphony to help us deal with certain threats. So here's the really cool part, though, that the emotion brain has a pathway to the environment, right? Both external and internal. And the thinking brain has a pathway to the environment, internal and external. The pathway of the emotion brain is more than twice as fast as the pathway of the thinking brain. So that's why when we're triggered by something, either, when you're driving, and what happens if a dog runs in front of your car, right? What happens? Before you know it, you've slammed on the brake. You don't know how you've done it,
Heart
right?
rate's gone through the roof.
Your heart rate's through the roof. Your breathing's heavy. You don't know what's happened, right? You've slammed on the brake, and then it's like, okay, that's what happened. Threat is over. Your body returns to normal. So the pathway of the emotion brain is more than twice as fast as the thinking brain. So we're literally feeling before we are thinking.
I just want to touch on that.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that came out of the trauma for me was emotional eating.
Yeah.
And what I was using it to soothe my feelings as opposed to talking about it.
Yeah.
And one thing I was able to do that actually helped, which touches exactly on what you just said, is I learned to breathe.
Yeah.
And I read that once I was breathing in a calm state, I was thinking from the prefrontal cortex. That's where I was making the decision: do I really need to eat this 9 bags of chips, or the? I had convinced myself. I had read. This is not an actual. This was a study, but it wasn't done on humans. I thought it was that 1 glass of red wine was equal to a workout at the gym. So I'm thinking, great, I'll do a full bottle. I got 4 hours of a workout. Finding out later it was done on mice.
Yes.
It was not done on humans. However, during that time, what helped was the emotional side of things to soothe the feelings that I had not even dealt with yet. I was kind of eating to kind of soothe those types of things, self-therapy.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until the suggestion was made that I should breathe. Mm-hmm. And in breathing, I wasn't doing, as you just said, kind of reacting constantly. I was able to kind of calm down. Yeah, absolutely. Breath is a really important relaxation kind of technique, right? That helps restore the body to homeostasis. Same with the self-talk, I suppose, right? So sorry, you said homeostasis. Can I just touch on that?
Yeah.
But the homeostasis is bringing us back.
Yeah.
So is that also not a bad thing? Can homeostasis can also bring us back to our old habits? Is that what? Homeostasis
more means like what the body, like how the body is working, right? So, it's just a state of rest and rest and relax, right? Rest and digest. It's like the state where the systems, like there's nothing wrong. We can just be, right? We can just be. This is, if you imagine like the lights turned off, right? This is how our body is wired, that the lights are off until there's a sudden threat or some sort of, right? Some sort of something alerts us. The light goes on, our stress response system kicks in. And then once we appraise that the threat is over, the light turns back off. That's how we are wired to be. Sometimes though, the light can go off, right? Again, if we're using like the analogy of the smoke detector, the smoke detector can go off if there's an actual fire or if we've burned the toast.
Yeah.
It's kind of up to us, right? To decide like, okay, is there a fire if I burn the toast? And with the breathing, we can remind ourselves, I've just burned some toast. There's no actual fire. And it helps turn the light back off. But what the breathing doesn't really do is it doesn't really rewire the smoke detector itself.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah. And that's kind of the difference between top-down processing, which engages the frontal lobes, right? If we're thinking about talking, self-talk, thoughts, that kind of thing, right? That engages the frontal lobes to then soothe the limbic system and the reptilian brain. So that's the difference from like top-down processing to bottom-up processing, which is working with that moment of trigger in the first place.
What's happening when you are doing the talk therapy? And the reason I ask that is what you just said. So I was using the tool of breathing to eat better, but I wasn't dealing with the trauma that's making me constantly eat type of thing. And so I can keep doing it, or I can actually deal with what it is.
Yeah.
And so we went through self-therapy and some self-talk where talking to ourselves about whatever the situation is. We're not using the right language. We have no modalities that we're actually using. So what's happening during talk therapy with yourself that you're doing that is helping us get to that point?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, traditional talk therapy, that's a bit of the critique, right? Is that traditional talk therapy really engages the frontal lobes, really engages this part of the brain, and can be really helpful in regulating, right? Can be really helpful in kind of teaching certain techniques and stuff to kind of regulate, but doesn't necessarily engage the limbic system, the emotion part of the brain. And so what I've been getting really into recently is emotion-focused therapy, which really focuses on that kind of bottom-up processing, really kind of tracking moment-to-moment experiences of the trigger and then what happened in the body, and then kind of going from there. Whereas traditional talk therapy, I think, has been known to really kind of engage that, this part of the brain. So then it can really feel, just to go back to the original question of the positive self-talk, I think it can really feel like we're trying to talk ourselves out of our feelings, right? We're trying to talk ourselves out of the way we feel.
I didn't want to talk about my feelings.
Yeah.
I wanted to smother them with.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. The feelings are so difficult, right? It's so difficult to experience them. And the thing is, sometimes the emotion brain, it can't tell time. So if there's a really difficult memory or a really difficult feeling that's been triggered in the emotion brain, it's really hard to separate out, like, this is my reaction to something that's happened in the past, and I'm feeling really unsafe now, right? And we kind of conflate the two, and we think, well, it must mean that whatever's going on right now is really dangerous, and I have to use whatever coping strategies I've learned to help keep myself safe. Whether it's eating, whether it's telling myself, right, like, this isn't so bad, get on with it, whether it's dissociating.
So the question that I want to get to is, you are seeing people, and although we are all individuals, we are all different, we all have our quirks and stuff like that with me. We're also all the same as well.
Yeah.
And there is common reactions to trauma.
Yeah.
So we're not, yes, we all are different, but there are some commonalities between us kind of coming in. So what are some of those?
Yeah. So, fight or flight is definitely the big one, right? So whenever we sense a threat, our body goes into a mode of protection. So either running away or fighting. And this is, we talked about this a little earlier. The heart is racing, the breathing is really fast, the blood flows from the brain to the limbs. The emotion brain hijacks the thinking brain, literally. We flip our lid. We flip our lid when we're emotional, right? When we're really emotional, it's hard to think straight. It's hard to think clearly. It's hard to think logically. We're wired that way. This is very protective because in a moment of threat, we don't have time to stand there and think logically like this, back in the day, back in the cave people day, right? The tiger's running at me, like, I don't have time to think. And right, no, I have to book it out of there, right? And the cave person who stands there waving at the tiger gets eaten. And so
I want to talk to that person. Well, I can't. They're
can't. They're dead. And their genes are long gone too, right? So through that, right, we've hardwired this fight or flight system. What we recently have learned, though, is that I shouldn't say too recently, but that there's a third reaction called the freeze reaction. Have you heard of that?
In general, like, oh my God, I just froze.
Yeah. In general, right? I'm just gonna get my notes up so I make sure I don't. So the freeze reaction is if our body senses that a serious threat or injury is about to happen and fight or flight is not available to us. We can neither run away nor can we fight back. The body numbs itself out. The heart rate slows, the breathing slows, and the brain floods itself with opioids to protect us from the pain or the injury. That's the freeze response. So a lot of people, it will also call it dissociation, right? It feels like you're leaving your body. It feels like you're watching a movie. Like it feels like this is like you're watching this happen. Right? This is the freeze response.
You hear of people who have been shot. They said, I didn't even know I was.
Yeah.
Until later.
The shock, right?
Yeah,
the shock of the system. Yeah. So it's really fascinating, and it's amazing, right? How our body and brain will do these things to literally protect us, to help us. The problem again, if we go back to somebody who is experiencing this over and over and over and over again in childhood, then that becomes almost the default setting of the brain, right? That dissociation, that response, the threat response, right? We're very adaptive creatures. We learn very quickly what helps us feel safe. But the thing is that what helps us feel safe in certain situations doesn't necessarily work in other situations, right? And can actually get in the way. Classic example of this is a soldier who's in a combat zone and has to be hyper aware of every single detail, right? That can be the difference between life and death in a war zone. You have to be hyper vigilant. You have to be constantly on guard. What happens when that soldier returns home to peace, right? To Canada or to the United States or whatever it is. There's no more war zone. But yet that same behavior, that same hypervigilance, which helped them, is actually now getting in the way, is actually now hindering their functioning.
How does one... I know I keep going back to this, but I want to be somewhat helpful to those that listen not similar to, but the actions in the sense of you're talking about that soldier who has been at that heightened state constantly. You have kids that we're in a heightened state of being in a home of constant yelling and it's not just a day. It's what tends to happen is that once we start to realize our parents are fighting and stuff like that, there's alcoholism in the home. Yeah. Is even though that fight happens on a Monday, I'm still feeling that because I know it's coming up again tomorrow and tomorrow. And when it goes for 20 years,
absolutely.
When I come out of it, it's the behavior is just like it's constant
Exactly.
like this. And so either I want to be alone, so I don't
Yeah.
want to, I want quietness. I remember I was a partner of mine many years ago. She slammed the cupboard door.
Yeah.
And I remember as a child hearing stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I saw her yell at her father. Like it was like a
Yeah.
fight in the home. And I
Yeah.
remember I took her aside and said, "Don't ever do
Yeah.
that again.
Yeah.
You can't." And that
Yeah.
triggered me
Yeah.
big time.
Yeah.
Where I'm
Yes.
trying to get with this is that came from that came from probably my father, who had to go through that. So where I'm going to is to need to talk about intergenerational trauma.
Yeah.
So it's coming from there. Like,
Yes.
it just keeps going.
Yes. So intergenerational trauma is this idea that a traumatic event or events experienced by, experienced directly can be passed on through multiple generations. And of course, my interest in this really comes from my own history, right? My grandparents surviving World War II in Russia as Jews and having, entire branches of their family wiped out in the Holocaust. And then seeing, certain reactions in my mother, certain parenting, right? And then seeing how that was passed down to me. And then also noticing that a lot of my friends and a lot of my relatives with similar cultural histories and genetic histories, having very kind of similar kinds of responses, right? And so that's where like my interest in this was really kind of peaked. And so again, it's this idea that trauma can be transmitted through multiple generations and in multiple ways, right? So this idea of epigenetics, right? That
Define that, please.
I'll do my best.
We're not all psychologists listening to this podcast.
No, I'll do my best. Epigenetics is this idea that our gene expression can be modified by severe trauma and stress, right? So the DNA code is not changed. The gene sequence is not changed, but how those genes are expressed can be impacted. And that can be passed on to offspring. But that's certainly, that's a big part of it, right? And I think that's fascinating. But again, it's not, it's not in my area kind of expertise, this idea of epigenetics. But it's this idea, right, that severe kind of trauma and stress can modify our gene expression, and that can be passed down. So like with me personally, since childhood, I have been a terrible sleeper. And I have a super exaggerated startle response. To all the listeners out there who want to know something interesting about me, I have a really exaggerated startle response. Actually, one of the research projects I was involved in at Stanford was setting up a stress test laboratory. And we had to calibrate the the sounds, right? The sounds, like the stress test is you're listening to like static and there's like a loud sound. And so we had to calibrate that. And we were calibrating that on me. And my physiological response, it was like through the roof. And I looked at that and I thought, geez, that's a really exaggerated startle response. And now I wonder if that's a way that the genetics I inherited from my grandparents, from my mom, who was a dissident in the Soviet Union, experienced her fair share of trauma, right? And so I'm born with like all of this in my body. But of course there's other ways, right? There's other ways that we transmit trauma to our offspring. Of course there's modeling, right? We see how our parents cope with difficult situations and difficult feelings.
Is that the most common?
I don't know if I would say it's the most common. I think it's, they're all, they all work together. They're all common and they all work together, right? And it's all parts of a puzzle that kind of fit together. So there's the modeling, but then there's the way that it's passed down through parenting, right? And through attachment. Because if we separate parents from children, we're disrupting healthy attachment patterns. We're disrupting healthy regulation. We're disrupting a healthy sense of parenting, right? And this can have significant repercussions for generations. Right? Which we're seeing now with all this talking about the indigenous,
First
right?
Nations,
Yeah,
yeah.
the First Nations, right? And those schools, my goodness, right? Forcibly separating children from parents, traumatizing children. And then you're expecting those children to parent themselves.
Yeah.
You know? And it's our early attachments, like, right? That I said before, that set the template for how relationships work, what to expect from relationships, what to expect from the world. And if we disrupt those, either with forced separation, with severe trauma, severe stress, that will have significant repercussions for generations to come. Right? An interesting piece of research, right, is that parents with unresolved trauma will often experience or interpret a look of fear on their child as a look of anger. Now imagine if you're dealing with unresolved trauma, right? If you've been traumatized, how different your reaction is going to be to a look of fear versus a look of anger. How much you will be triggered as a parent, right? How hard it would be in that moment to respond sensitively and with emotional availability. And so we just see these patterns, right? Passed down from generation to generation.
Well,
Yeah.
we never, our parents come from different backgrounds.
Yeah.
So mine coming from India,
Yeah.
I don't know if they even spoke about therapy
Yeah,
back then, that we
yeah.
need to deal with this.
Yeah.
And I think it's culturally as well. Now I can only speak on, I had registered clinical psychologist Gabriel on Petrich, one of my first or second podcasts I did, and he was from Argentina, and he said it's part of the culture there to be going to therapy. And we were kind of laughing, like, it's here. I was like, I got to go to yoga. I'll see you after that.
Yeah.
He was, there. It's like, I'm going to go to my therapy.
I've heard that about Argentina.
Yeah. And he said it was just part of growing up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And
That's really cool.
some cultures don't have that, and we
absolutely not.
take that behavior. One thing I was cognizant about was alcohol. And I think I was going down the same path, and it wasn't until one day I just made myself a drink in the evening, like 12, 13 years ago. I was like, it's a Monday.
Yeah.
And that was it.
Yeah. Wow.
It was like,
Powerful.
oh my God, like it's a Monday. You know, I'm doing it for the smell of it. And then I finally got aware, because prior to that, you know, hanging out with the people that are around me, we all think it's funny. We all think it's getting to the point you can't feel your face. Oh, this is hilarious.
Yeah.
And, but when you don't have the right people around you, and I can't even expect them to know, we're all trying to go through it together.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And that's what it is, right? It's having the right people around you. It's having that social support. It's having people who understand you and support you.
So we've talked a lot about the trauma and how we feel, but there's also this other, I see it as a positive word, which is resilience.
Yeah.
So tell me about resilience.
Yeah. So resilience is kind of the ability to return to baseline functioning after a stressor occurs. It's the ability to effectively deal with problems and stress. It's kind of growth that happens after something difficult occurs. But resilience isn't just something we're just kind of born with, or something that just that just happens. Although I'm sure there are genetic kind of predispositions to this kind of stuff. But and the truth is, if we kind of talking about common reactions to trauma, the truth is that if a traumatic event occurs, right, like I'm talking about, like, we're doing okay, right? I'm doing okay. And God forbid I get into a car accident. Most people following a traumatic event will develop some sort of PTSD symptoms, right? They might have trouble sleeping. They might have significant anxiety when driving. Have some sort of PTSD-ish symptoms. But in most people, it resolves, right? And this idea of how does it resolve? And why does it resolve in some, but not in others? And one of the biggest predictors, probably the single strongest predictor, is the quality of social support, right? Having people around us that care about us, that we feel that we can reach and kind of get that support. These people probably, right, won't let you avoid following a trauma, right? It's the avoidance that reinforces the anxiety around certain triggers and certain cues, right? So having friends that will not let me avoid driving, but that will say, oh, no, you're meeting us at this restaurant at this time, right? And I'm forced to get into my car and drive, which then eventually will lower my anxiety around it. For children, teens, preteens who have gone through a trauma, often when they share that trauma, the response that they get is really important in terms of how they process it, right? If the trauma is not done by the caregiver, the response from the caregiver becomes massively important, right? In terms of helping the teen or preteen kind of process.
Assuming the parent knows how to. But
yeah.
We could have gotten the trauma from the parent.
Well, yes, exactly, right. So if we're talking about trauma that's not coming from the caregiver, is the response from the caregiver. And again, it's that kind of quality of social support, which is really, really important in helping us move forward and grow. Routine and self-care, I think, those cannot be overstated. Just the importance of the basics.
Routine.
Self-care, right? Sleep, healthy eating, exercise. These tend to be like the foundation. If you're building a house, right? You have to have a solid foundation. Otherwise, whatever house you build, it's going to be wobbly. So
can we, are we allowed, not allowed, can we begin rebuilding that foundation at any point?
Absolutely. By going back to the basics, right? That's part of developing a sense of internal safety and a sense of internal regulation and control, a sense of control over our body, right? Going back to the basics, focusing on making sure we have routine and consistency in our actions, particularly around these kinds of three things, right? Sleep, nutrition, and exercise. Routine and consistency are really important, right? I think what that does is it helps us maintain a sense of control over our world, a sense of predictability. You see this in daycares, right? You see, like when my kids were in daycare, their days were structured like right to the minute, like 8 to 8:30 outside play, 8:30 to 9 circle time, 9 to 9:30 snack, right? Or whatever it is. And within these activities, of course, they have variation and they have choice, but the structure of the day was really, really consistent. And so these little kids who have no idea how to tell time, they know if they're outside playing, that means what comes next is circle time. And if they're in circle time,
nap time.
well, what comes next is nap time, right? And it helps them maintain a sense of safety and a sense of control over their universe, because the universe is a really chaotic and scary, right? A scary thing. And so we want to, right, develop these kinds of patterns to help us maintain a sense of safety and a sense of control.
Reflection.
Yeah, reflection is the ability to think about our own thoughts and feelings, is ability to think about our own emotions, right? Reflection and parenting. It's ability to think about our parenting style, to think about, what am I doing? How is it working? How is it not working? All right. Kind of goes hand in hand, I think, with emotion regulation. Like you were talking about the breathing, right? Self-talk, gratitude, grounding. These are all examples of emotion regulation that help us maintain a sense of control over our internal world, right? Over what's going on inside of us. A sense of meaning, a sense of purpose in our life. This is based on Viktor Frankl's work, who was a psychiatrist that survived Auschwitz. And after
The Man's Search for Meaning.
The Man's Search for Meaning,
Yes.
yes. Powerful book, right? But about how a sense of meaning and purpose and connection is essential in our lives. Growth mindset.
So that really, when I saw that
Yeah.
in the notes of talking
Yeah.
points, I was thinking, oh, here we go.
Yeah,
Self-help.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a popular one to talk about right now. It's gaining traction out there in the self-help universe, and I think just in pop culture, right? We hear this term a lot. So this is helping ourselves, helping our children view mistakes not as failures, but as opportunities to learn.
That's why you have Thomas Edison there.
Yes, Thomas Edison.
Oh.
Yes, the anecdote, right, about the light bulb and how he failed like 5,000 times until he got it right, and he was asked, how does it feel to fail so many times? And he said, I didn't fail that many times. I just learned what not to do that many times. Which eventually helped him get it right.
I'll make sure I use that definition next time someone says, I've told you 9 times. Yes, but I know 9 times what not to do.
Exactly.
I'll see how well that goes over.
Yeah. So that's it. Right? That's kind of, sorry. So I think this growth mindset really kind of helps foster also our sense of confidence, our sense of self-efficacy. Right? If we're thinking about our mistakes not as a definition of like I'm a success or I'm a failure, but I made a mistake. What can I learn from it? You know.
Then you have the emotional regulation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Controlling what?
Yeah. Well, it's again, kind of the difference between top-down processing, right? Bottom-up processing. Emotion regulation, I think in more traditional sense, is being able to engage the frontal lobe to soothe the emotion brain, right? Because what happens when we're really upset is it hijacks the thinking brain, right? So it's hard to think clearly. It's hard to plan. It's hard, right? And we can feel like we are in a tsunami of feelings. Or the opposite. We can feel completely numbed out from our feelings, right? So it's kind of using certain strategies to help soothe and regulate the emotion brain. So a really great one, and a really one that makes so much sense, right? And you can use it with children too. Like, have you ever noticed with little kids when they're really, really upset, and you simply say to them, "You're really upset right now." It's like something just settles down in them, because by using language. By putting the language on the experience and on the feeling, you're engaging the frontal lobe right away. And so right away, there's a shift in the brain, right?
I'll have to use that with my nieces.
Yeah, absolutely, right? You're feeling so scared. You're feeling so sad. You're so angry. And I don't think it works much differently with ourselves, right? When you notice something, right? Oh, I'm feeling really upset right now. Yeah. Neat, huh?
I'm just kind of floored. These little tools that you're giving us, to use.
Yeah. Examples.
And what about relationships?
Yeah. Oh, well, I've included this quote, right, from Dr. Bruce Perry. I just love it. That relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love. Right? It's powerful stuff. Again, we're not wired to do this hard stuff alone. That's not how we're built. That's not how our brains are built. Right? And trauma can be so isolating. It can be such a sense of shame and isolation and right, that prevents us from being able to connect with others. And when we're not able to connect with others, we feel even more alone, right? Even more isolated, even more lonely. Relationships are the agents of change. And the most powerful therapy is human love.
On that note, thank you.
You're very welcome.
for coming in. There will definitely be a part 2. I really appreciate you coming on, Anna, and I'm going to end
Yeah.
it just on that quote.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.